man, I'll tell you what, that dang old internet, man, you just go on there and point and click, get in there and talk about www. Call me, you got that.
For some reason or another, you sound a little taller on radio.
Well, for my money, he's got all the facial characteristics of a criminal.
Now, here's your host, that gravy sopping, crappie flopping, stump jumping, Bible thumping, gun toting, mater growing son of a gun, the backwoods Baptist himself, Pastor Harold Smith.
It's good to be introduced by my late friend, Troy McGahan. I love hearing his voice every time we start the podcast. And I love that fine picking from my good friend, Donnie Poindexter, who he kills it. He is a banjo wizard. I don't know, that sounds bad. Maybe he's a banjo prodigy. Maybe that sounds better. But he's wonderful with bluegrass, and I'm gracious that he's played me a little background music all these years here on the podcast. I want to welcome you to the Backwoods Baptist Podcast. We are going to talk about something that's the elephant in the room. It needs to be discussed. We're going to talk about work. Probably more importantly, the lack of it. There is an aversion to work, and I guess that's part of sin, that mankind doesn't want to work, but it needs to be discussed. We really need to develop a healthy appreciation of work. I'm coming to you today from the Backwoods Baptist World Headquarters at the Backwoods Book Company in downtown Van Buren, 522 Main Street, Van Buren, Arkansas. We have a free Christian bookstore here. We give away books every Saturday from 9 to 5. It is a rainy, flooding day here on the southern coast of the Ozarks. I say southern coast because it seems that the Arkansas River has swollen to the edge of the mountains, and that's where we're located at. So the backwoods are soggy, to say the least. You too might be a Backwoods Baptist if you have a rain gauge in your yard, or if when you get to church on Sundays, you notice people asking, how many inches did you get? How much did y'all get? And you'll know the depth of your backwoodsiness if they say everything in tenths of an inch. Oh, we got 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 8 tenths. Then you really, you're back there. You're with my kind of folk then. Anyways, why are we talking about work or the lack thereof? The reason we're going to do that is because President Trump has been declaring that he's going to put America back to work. He's going to make America wealthy again. He's going to make America manufacturing again. He's going to drill. He's going to dig. He's going to put Americans back to work. And I think this is great. And I think Americans need to get back to work. The problem that I'm concerned about is that the workforce that was available, say, 30 years ago when I was in my early 20s, that workforce doesn't exist today. I see a lot of people that are not working. I see a lot of people just running around with their kids in the middle of the week. They're at the grocery store, they're in front of me, and they're younger than me, and they're not working. They seem to be healthy. I don't know, who am I to judge whether you really have some kind of disability or not, but just the sheer numbers of unemployed people that don't seem to be interested in working make me wonder if America still has a workforce or if America has gotten lazy. And I believe I could argue in the affirmative that America has gotten lazy. Now, I'm no political mastermind. I don't sit and talk about economics or labor force. I look at the world and issues facing the church today with an open Bible and a heaping helping of country fried common sense. And I think if we apply that logic to the situation, what we're dealing with is we need to be manufacturing our own products. You want to pin me down politically? Let's try the tariffs. Let's go forward, see what happens. We've been paying tariffs. Why don't people pay us tariffs? I think it would create more American jobs. I think we might have to pay a little more in the beginning. That's okay. There used to be a thing called American Made. As a matter of fact, I think the Oak Ridge Boys sang about it, that their baby was American made. And that used to be a source of pride, but nearly everything I pick up says made in China. And when it says made in China, that means China is doing all the manufacturing. Americans are not manufacturing. We're just sitting around, and there's a growing gap between the elite wealthy that are doing well and the middle class is really the lower 50% of the entire American population. And I think it's a noble cause that Trump is excited about this, and guy with the Department of Labor and the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce and the Treasury Department, and they're going to get Americans working again. The problem and the thing that concerns me, and I think the elephant in the room, is that I think a lot of the younger Americans just don't have a proper theology of work. I'm just going to say it. I think a lot of the younger people in this country today are flat out lazy, and I blame their parents for letting them grow up that way. Their parents thought that work was bad and that idle time was good, so they never gave the kids work to do, or they gave them menial tasks and told them to do this and get their allowance, when in reality, what should have been happening is they should have been working for everything they got. So when we talk about this, now look, I'm not against rest. About a year and a half ago, I did a podcast just on rest. I advocated taking one day a week and making it your Sabbath. Now, I don't advocate Sabbath keeping, like you have to cook in a crock pot the night before and sit in the dark and you can't go anywhere but church. But I believe you ought to have a day out of the week where you cease from labor. You don't work. Working 7 days a week is not healthy. It's not normal. It's not good for mankind. And there may be times you have to work. I remember times in my life I worked 30 days straight. I'm going to tell you, I wasn't the healthiest at that time. So I'm advocating for a day of rest each week. I advocate for vacations. A man ought to take some time off. He ought to get away from his job. He ought to check out from his responsibilities. Just as Christ went up into the wilderness for a time period, where he escaped into a desert place for a time period, where he put the apostles on a boat and they went to the other side to escape their labors. I advocate for vacation. But for crying out loud, if you've not been to work, you don't need a vacation. And that's what we're dealing with. We got people that are living on a permanent vacation. I advocate that pastors ought to take a sabbatical. Ever so often, maybe once a year, they ought to take a week and don't go to the beach with their wife and kids, but go somewhere by themselves for a week. Sit down, read your Bible like you don't normally read it every day. Read large portions, maybe pick one book and read it every day for the entire week. Meditate on some specific topic. Spend that week planning and preparing for the ministry that you have. I think pastors need time off, but I also think pastors need to work. And so I think today I want to talk about the theology of work. And I've tried to surround myself and befriend pastors that work. And what I see are a lot of pastors that don't work. But as I look at some of my closest friends in the ministry, many of them are bivocational men. They're working a full-time job and they're a full-time pastor. Just because you're bivocational don't mean you're a part-time pastor. You still do all the things a normal pastor does, but you also hold down a job, either part-time or full-time, to make ends meet. And I think pastors shouldn't be afraid of work. And if there's one stigma that preachers have gotten over the years is they only work 3 hours a week, or they only work 2 days a week. And then some churches, for crying out loud, they don't even have 2 services a week. They just meet on Sundays, or they just have some little get-together that the Sunday school teachers now teach on Wednesday nights. Preachers ought to preach. They ought not just preach, they ought to pastor. They ought not just pastor, they ought to oversee. They ought not oversee, they ought to shepherd. When we talk about this, there's a whole lot more to being a pastor than just preparing a sermon. I know a lot of preachers that lock themselves in their study and can't be bothered for certain hours of the day because they're preparing a sermon. It doesn't take 40 hours to prepare a sermon. I'm sorry. You're just spending a lot of time reading books. Pray, study, and get up and deliver what God's given you. There's more to pastoring than study. You can't do this. You can't. This is just the people that like to read books using the office of pastor as an excuse not to work. Shepherding a flock of God, if you're a preacher, requires hospital visits, marriage counseling, weddings, funerals, and not just for those in your congregation, but for all people that you're going to be encountering in the ministry. It's an ongoing thing that requires more than just preparing a sermon, and that's what I see over and over and over again. So, with that being said, if I'm concerned about Trump having a adequate workforce and I'm concerned about the ministry, what is the theology of work? The theology of work actually exists before the theology of rest. The Lord looked upon his works. God was a worker. God was working. God still is working. God worked for 6 days. And at the end of 6 days, he rested or ceased from his labors. He didn't do that because he was tired. He did that to set an example for us. But before we can rest, we've got to work. And so we need to be engaged in a 6-day work week. Well, Brother Harold, I work 4 tens. Well, bless your heart, you've got a part-time job. Working 4 tens is 40 hours. Well, that is a full-time job. Who in the Bible worked 40 hours a week? I'll wait for your answer. Who clocked in at 9 and went home at 5 with an hour lunch? I'll wait for your answer. Nobody. You saw people working for 1 day, the day laborers, but the first round of laborers agreed to work the entire day from the first hour to the 12th hour. They worked 12-hour shift. And when we look at the theology of work and we look at how those people worked, they worked 6 days a week. They might have worked a few hours in the vineyard. They might have worked a few hours in the field. They might have worked a few hours in the sheepfold. But we have David, future king of Israel. There's a festival being held at his father's house, and he's out keeping the sheep, and it's nighttime. He's working beyond 40 hours a week. No shepherd's working 40 hours a week because sheep don't eat 40 hours a week. The point I'm driving at is this. We've got this Americanized idea that 40 hours is a full week, and if we've put in 40 hours, we've done our part. Let me be realistic with you. A normal work week would be more akin to 60 hours a week. 60 hours a week. And there's a lot of people complaining that they don't have what they want, but they only work 40 hours a week. If you're working 40 hours a week, you've got time for a side job after you get off. If you're working 4 tens, you have time for work. If you're working Monday through Thursday, you could have another job on Friday and Saturday. Don't think of this as something you're punching a clock for. Think of it as you're writing a book that you're going to publish. Think of it as that you're building a YouTube channel that's going to provide money for you. Think of it as a job you're going to work 2 days a week, like cleaning swimming pools. Think of it as maybe you're going to wash windows. Maybe you're going to mow lawns on Friday and Saturday. All of these are things that I've done in my free time in order to make ends meet. And I'm saying that not just to say, oh, look at what I've done. That's normal. That's the kind of stuff my dad did. And then my dad landed a job that required him to work 60 hours a week to maintain the job. And he did it. And he went to church and he taught Sunday school and he served as a deacon and he did all that and worked 60 hours a week. And he loved us. And he raised us and he invested in us and he cared for us. Why? Because my dad understood the theology of work. Mankind needs to work. Now look, mankind was given a job to do before the curse. He was to keep the garden that the Lord had planted. Keeping the garden was not the same level of work as keeping a garden afterwards. The garden was the Garden of Eden planted by God. Adam, after the curse, had to plant his own garden, had to toil, had to break the ground, had to sweat. Part of the curse on men, is that they have to earn their keep. We've got a whole group of people that are not earning their keep. Now look, Part of this curse is that we toil. There's a lot of people that don't toil. They got a good, easy job. They got a gravy job. I'm not going to list any of them because I don't know who's listening, but you can probably think of somebody and you go, man, that person has got it made. Part of work should be sweat. You say, well, Brother Harold, I'm in the financial sector. I'm in the real estate. I'm in whatever. I'm a tech guru. I'm a rocket scientist. I don't ever sweat. Let me explain something to you. If you're not regularly toiling, doing something difficult for your body, if you're not regularly sweating out some of the toxins that are in your body, you're not going to be a healthy person for very long. I've always been a heavy guy. I was heavy when I got out of basic training. I was within a pound of my maximum weight, and I still had a six-pack stomach back then. How could I be almost too fat to be in the military and have a six-pack? Well, I was just a big guy. I've always been that way. Now, when I got out of the military and I got a job in a wire plant, and I worked 12-hour shifts, 3 on, 4 off, 4 on, 3 off. And I worked another part-time job as well. I did all of that and still gained weight. Well, what happened? I learned not to work so hard. I learned how to do things the easy way. Even in a wire plant, I learned how to work smarter, not harder. I learned to sweat less and stand more. I learned what I needed to do and didn't need to do. And then I ended up getting some sales jobs and some jobs where I didn't do as much physical labor, and I did more talking, more phone calls, more lunch conferences and meeting for meals, and I got just plumb fat. Fat is a killing hog. And I had to get the weight off. But the problem was the work that I'm engaged in doesn't require me to sweat. I may sweat a little when I'm preaching, but I don't sweat enough like I need to. So I either needed to join a gym. I tried that for a while. Got tired of looking at half-naked ladies. Gave it up. I decided what I would do is work. I would find toiling jobs and work. So I began cutting firewood. I began putting in a big garden. I began doing a lot of things that required me to do physical exertion. And I did them to the point I was tired. And I did them regularly. I walked, I jogged, I did all these things because I need to sweat. If we will find a work that we enjoy, that's outside, that gives us sunshine and toil and sweat, it's actually good for us. I think something that we need to take away from the podcast, if you haven't gotten mad yet that I've criticized your inactivity and your excessive vacations, let me say this: work is a normal thing. We were designed to work. Even before the fall, as I mentioned, Adam was supposed to work. He wasn't just sitting around eating grapes off the bottom of a cluster. Work is a normal thing. It's a normal function for human beings. Work is not only normal, work is needful. Work actually makes us healthy. It's people that work regularly that live the longest lives. I had an uncle, great uncle, Joe Heiss, born in 1889. I knew him as a child, still alive, still doing well. Uncle Joe built a rock wall around 5 acres of the property he lived on when he was 75. He built it with a pick, a pry bar, and a wheelbarrow, and it was on the side of a mountain, and the name of the mountain was called the Devil's Backbone. So what kind of mountain you think Uncle Joe at 75's wheeling rocks up to? How did Uncle Joe live to be 93 and never spend a day in the hospital till the week he died? He got up every day and went to work. He ate fried eggs and bacon, made his own wine and beer. He did all the things you're not supposed to do, but because he was an active worker, sweated regularly, he even walked to work when he had a job and walked home, and he owned a car, but he didn't want to burn the gas. Those kind of guys live long, healthy lives because work is not only normal, it's needful, and we need it for our health. We need it for our finances. If you're lacking and you've got free time, go to work. If you've got a half a day out of the week that you're not doing anything, go to work. Now look, you can overwork yourself. I've had to learn that lesson. I still struggle with working too much. I started a YouTube channel called Preacher's Day Off, just so I would take one day of the week off and rest from my labors. But I've never lacked for money because I've never been afraid to work. If I needed money, I didn't start a GoFundMe. I started another job. I started another venture to make money. Work is not only normal and needful, work is noble. We're in such a day where if you have a job that you work with your hands, people look down on you. They want to know what college you went to, what seminary you went to. If you tell them you went to a trade school and that you learned how to be a welder, they look down their nose like you somehow have a lower job, when in reality, he doesn't have all the school debt that you're trying to get the government to pay off, and he's making twice what you're making. And he's in control of himself, not sitting there working for some big corporation. So I say all this to say work is noble. Every time I see a young person working, every time I'm at a fast food restaurant and I see that young kid that's probably 17 that's taking their job serious, they're working hard, they're wiping down the ice cream case, they're over there cleaning up, the fry oil and doing the nasty jobs. I give them an encouragement. I say, man, I appreciate you working so hard. You're going to go a long ways in life. Work is a noble thing. Laziness is to be despised. Go read Proverbs. Laziness is to be shunned. Lazy people are not to be rewarded. It's noble people. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor with his hands that he may have to give. I really think that we ought to be, if we want to do something special in the church, go raise the money for it. Don't sit around and beg for it. Go to work. And I don't mean, hey, we'll wash your car if you give $100 to the youth. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just go get a job and give the money to the church. If you think something needs to be done in church, it's not getting funded, why don't you work a couple extra hours each week and give that overtime pay in the plate and designate it to what you want it to go toward? There was a time in my pastoring that the church was kind of tight on funds, and I went and got a part-time job. I didn't reduce my salary at the church, and I didn't reduce my responsibilities at the church. But I took the money from that part-time job every week, and I didn't use it on me. I used it to buy things that were necessary for the church. And by necessary, I mean we put on the church's first Bible conference in a couple of years. It cost the church $0. I paid for every minister that preached out of my pocket. Why? Because I'd went and worked a part-time job. I paid for their meals. The preachers that came in to preach, I would take them out to eat. I paid for them in their time here with the money that I had made in a part-time job. There were things that were needed in the youth group. I just went and purchased them. They were there. Nobody knew how they got there. There was stuff that was broken that needed to be fixed. It got replaced and repaired. Nobody knew who did it. Well, I guess they know now, but none of those people are listening to this podcast that only my mother and a couple other people listen to out of pure curiosity. The point I'm driving at is work is a noble thing, and it carries rewards. And you can take your physical secular work and turn it into rewards in heaven by sharing the labors that you've given and the reward you've received for your labor. You could turn and invest that labor into what's going on in the church. I can think of some really sweet people that I used to pastor. And they knew the church had a need. And they came to me, and the guy said, look, I'm old enough to retire, but I choose to work just because I want to and I like it. And he said, we're saving up a bunch of money to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to give that to the church. You go purchase this big thing the church needs. If I remember right, it was a heat and air unit. He just paid for it out of his pocket. And he gave that money and that unit to the church. Nobody in church knew who he was. What did he do? He understood that work is a normal part of life. And he turned that work into a heavenly reward that will be compensated after he passes away and stands before the Lord and receives the due reward for his labors. Look, work is normal, needful, and noble. I could belabor that all day. Let's talk about pastors. Pastors have a reputation of being lazy. And I think the reputation, they have to own it. Many of them are. And this is what you'll hear with pastors. I said this a lot too. My number one responsibility is to my family. I'm not going to let my pastoring get in front of my family. Okay, great, attaboy. But wouldn't be out of line to spend 60 hours a week pastoring people, would I? Oh, that's too much. You shouldn't be pastoring that much. You're going to let that interfere with your family. No, it's not. My dad worked 60 hours a week. I worked 60 hours a week before I became a pastor. I didn't start preaching until I was 31. 60 hours a week was a normal week. So because I'm a pastor now, I need to be home more. Because I'm a pastor now, I need to work less. I don't think so. If that's what you're saying, hey, I'm a pastor, I don't have to work as much as the average man, then what you're telling the normal man that's working 60 hours a week is that his job is more important than his family, when in reality, if you look back at human history, we've always worked 12-hour days. We've always worked 10-hour days, and we usually work 6 days a week. And the Bible prescribes a 6-day work week. When pastors say that they need to stay home with their wife during the week, they need to stay home with their kids during the week, what they're actually saying is, I can be a pastor and not work as much as a normal guy has to work and still provide for my family. I know some really good jobs out there that don't require a lot of work and they make really good money. That shouldn't be said of pastors. That shouldn't be said of the Lord's servants. God's people who are employed on the Lord's payroll by the faithful givings and offerings of the Lord's people should be the hardest working people in the church. They should be the first one to put their hand to the plow and the last one to take their hand off. So many pastors have reduced their ministry into punching a time clock. They go in at 9 o'clock, they get off at 3 o'clock. They're off on Fridays. I don't know what they do on Saturdays. I'm sure they're busy on Sundays. Look, preacher, work. If you work a part-time job or a full-time job, you know full well what I'm talking about. It's hard to balance both. But your wife and your kids are not going to feel neglected because you're working 50 or 60 hours a week. Instead, what your wife and kids need to realize is that my daddy and my husband is the guy that goes out and works hard for our family. And there's absolutely nothing that he's willing to, there's nothing that he won't do to make ends meet. And if God calls him to be a pastor, he's going to work just as hard as a pastor as he did when he delivered chips for Frito-Lay. He's going to work just as hard as when he sold swimming pool products for South Central Pool Supplies. He's going to work just as hard as he did at Beckert Steel Wire Manufacturing. My daddy and my husband is going to put his all into everything he does, whether it's for the Lord or for somebody else. And let me tell you something, that's biblical. Do everything you do as unto the Lord. I like having some time off. I like a vacation. I like a nice, easy week. But in this life, we will suffer tribulation, persecution. It ain't going to be easy. It wasn't meant to be easy. If pastoring's easy and doesn't take much out of you, I suggest you find some more ministries and plug yourself in. Load your wagon. Get involved everywhere you can. Why? Because pastors already have a reputation of being lazy and running off with the church secretary. So why wouldn't those of us that take the job serious go above and beyond to change the reputation around instead of joining those that don't? I began by talking about Trump's desire to put America back to work again. I got so excited, I said, I may need to go find a part-time job and just join the workforce. Why? Because I want to see my country succeed. I want to see my church succeed. I want to see my family succeed. And I'm proud of my children, both of whom are adults and have their own lives, and both of them are holding down steady jobs. They're not afraid to take extra work outside of that job. I'm proud of that. I'm proud that they are working. I'm proud of the work that they do. All I'm saying is this. We as pastors have got to model what it looks like to work, because we want a church that works. You may not be a pastor. Don't be ashamed of your job. If you're getting up every morning or every night and you're going to your job and you're faithful, you be the absolute best employee there because you profess to be a Christian and you want them to know this is what Christians do, this is how Christians believe in work, and this is why we work. All of these things, every one of them, is important. Why? Because we need to get back to work. Pastor, if you're pastoring a small church and it doesn't require a lot of your time to visit those people, to prepare your sermons, find yourself another ministry that you can be involved in. Maybe it's online. Maybe you need to be writing some things. Maybe you need to be engaged in evangelism. Maybe you need to be supporting some missionaries in some way. There's lots of ministries. Pastors can be engaged and plugged in a number of areas outside of just their local church. And believe me, if you love your wife and you love your kids, they're going to know that God called you to go to work. And working 5 10s, that's 50 hours a week. That's normal. That's not unnormal. That's normal. Working 6 10s, that's better than working 6 12s. Take a vacation. Take a day off. Spend time with your wife and kids. But let's get back to work. Let's not be lazy. If we've got idle time, let's utilize it for the betterment of the kingdom of God. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. I hope I've stirred you up to get to work. You say, Brother Harold, I'm already working. I've worked myself to a frazzle. Well, go listen to my podcast on rest. And after you take a break, get back to work. See you guys on the next podcast.